Welcome to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where Peter Madison and David Sherrock discuss the complexities of adopting new ways of working at scale. Hello, Dave. How are you doing?
Peter, great to hear from you. I had a question for you, just to kick things off. I'm scratching my head. I've been working on organizational change and why it's difficult, digital AI. We've talked about many of these things. But I wondered if we could explore maybe the foundational bit, that immune response that we see in organization that makes that change difficult.
It's an interesting one. And you and I have been operating this space for a very long time. And as we know, especially as organizations get larger, it's harder and harder to implement change because there's more and more people, more and more individual, if we're in the AI world now, non-deterministic nodes, the people in your organization.
Warm-blooded, non-deterministic nodes.
Warm-blooded, non-deterministic nodes, yes. The people are actually very, very good at change. It's just en masse. People who have been subjected to very sort of rigid systems, or they've observed certain behaviors, or they've been doing things for a long time, it becomes harder for them to change because they conform to the system that they operate with. And so it becomes difficult for them. So even though the individual pieces can change, changing the entire system, the entire organization can be much harder.
Well, and I'd actually add to that the systems, the structure within which you're trying to achieve some form of change, those organizational practices and the support systems are expressly designed to limit change.
Yeah,
they're actually there to stabilize, to literally, in Kotter's 8 steps, they talk about one, I think it's step number 7 or 8, is institutionalize change. And that institutionalizing change means put the structures in place so that that change is stable and we don't revert back or move forward from that. We stabilize and solidify a change to a new norm.
Yeah, and which we need because we want things to be consistent and we want the system to be repeatable and we want things to happen in the same or at least a somewhat similar way over and over and over again. So you need consistency. And so we have systems and rules and all of those rigid pieces.
Well, as you're describing it, Peter, it reminds me of the conversations that we've had in the last few months around context, and that articulation of what is the stable pieces that we're working, what is the purpose, what are the goals, but also these institutional practices often stabilize around certain ways of working, certain norms within the organization, what we often describe as culture. These are locked in by how we report to one another, whether that organization has a culture of one-on-ones or much more visible, say, steering coordination meetings around projects and things like this. How they manage work, what structures are in place will often determine how easy it is to make changes.
Yes, if you have, and I've seen this in a few organizations, more than a few actually, but where it's almost not allowed to talk to the person across the row from you because, well, you're not allowed to talk to somebody if there isn't a project code for you to charge that time to. That type of behavior, that stifles the ability to have change because people can't easily interact.
It's expressly designed to limit the fluctuations that you might see. Skip level meetings is another practice that actually starts breaking some of those things down that you'll hear when you see these conversations being pushed beyond the normal lines of reporting.
Yeah, and we know that. So we know that organizational change is hard, and we talk about things like the organizational immune system. They also describe this as the permafrost layer, where it's very hard for the translation to get through in the way you're expecting it to across the organization because you've got all these competing incentives, and everybody's sort of got their own little pieces that they have to be concerned about and ensure it gets delivered. And if your incentives misaligned, then all sorts of, it's very hard to change.
Well, so one of the reasons I appreciate this conversation is what we'll often do, we come into an organization, we want to affect change, we have new ideas, we want to innovate to bring these new ideas to the table, and we see these as barriers. And if we reframe that to understand that there are these structures that are in place that generate the behaviors that are making the organization work the way they are today, then it's less about a barrier that needs removing. Because when you remove those barriers, what you often find is you end up in a place which is not where you want to be. because you've now taken away these constraints. And so all of a sudden, things can happen that you didn't expect. And it's more about changing and adjusting those so that you're rebuilding them to support the place that you want to get to.
Yeah, so the changing the incentives, so the incentives will guide people to start going in the direction you want them to, creating space and permission for people to experiment or to try new things, so that are going in where you want that change to go, so that you're creating the ideal conditions for the change to thrive, which is the
well, and I think one of the things that we want to bear in mind is that we should not make those changes lightly.
No, and we shouldn't minimize the difficulty in doing this either. I mean, it is not an easy thing to do. There's as can be shown by any number of statistics, which will quite happily tell you how hard it is for transformation to work and how often it fails.
Yeah, and so what I find as we're looking at something like this, I think there's a couple of things that really jump out. One is, if we're not deliberate about those changes, we can end up in places that we don't want to be. And there's a myriad of stories around this. Anybody who's going through an MBA, for example, or any sort of executive education will have these case studies pulled out and talked about at length. The current one that I'm seeing mentioned quite a lot, for whatever reason, is the Boeing McDonnell Douglas merger, which shifted Boeing away from an engineering first, technical kind of quality type of mindset, where decisions were often the engineers making the decisions were elevated in the organization. They were listened to. They had a lot of impact on decisions being made within the organization. And that when McDonnell Douglas, the merger happened, the leadership from McDonnell Douglas sort of brought their mindset to the table, which was much more shareholder driven, finance driven, sort of, looking at making sure we get the time, the schedules agreed, pushing things through what might be considered at the cost of product quality and technical quality, which has led to Boeing being in a situation. One of the things that is one of the things in the situation that they are in there.
One of the common pieces, and this is partly my DevOps background, but one of the common ones that you see there too is that when finance is the ones making those decisions, redundancy in the system is seen as waste. Yeah. So they end up reducing the costs where actually the redundancy is needed. And that redundancy would have actually stopped planes dropping out of the sky. Maybe I don't know, but there's other simple examples of situations like this. Is why do we need two network switches? Well, because we need to be able to parallelize access into those two different systems. If we don't, and we only have one, then it's possible for one person to wipe out the data the other one has, and we don't have a redundancy to back it up onto. Things like this, just really at the lower level, where there's very good engineering reasons to do things in a particular way, but that doesn't always translate well into the accounting ledger. So.
Well, and the consequences of these things, because a lot of organizations will suddenly go into some sort of contraction stabilization. We're going to manage everything, as you said, from the financial perspective. That the headache is that can often squash out or significantly shift those systems, the ways of working within the organization. And so what you're seeing in the Boeing case, for example, is that as much as Boeing wants to shift back to an engineering driven or an engineering first mindset, it isn't a switch that you can turn on and off. No. It's something that once you've eroded it, it's a little bit like trust. These sort of human interaction elements, once you erode them, it takes a long, long time to build those up. Persistent, consistent activity, which is aligned to rebuilding whatever it is that has been lost.
Yeah, we were talking about this last time we were chatting about behavior. Like leadership behavior is a key part of this, and if you've got new leaders, different leaders behaving in a different way, it'll change the culture of your organization, and changing the leader's behavior can be very difficult.
It's interesting because as you're describing that, I think we're moving back into that organizational honesty or dishonesty conversation that we started, and that kind of perspective as to, at some point, the behaviors, the messages that you get from your leadership and the behaviors that they express, they show, have to be pretty closely aligned for you to be able to build those changes in culture, those changes in organizational sort of immune responses, and so that new practices can be adopted across the organization.
And that is especially true with AI, of course, because
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a huge disruptor into the organization at every level, and
Yeah.
you're going to have different levels of adoption in different ways, and it's
Yeah.
not really enough just at the top say I want AI, which I think we've moved
Well,
past
yeah.
that stage almost in most places.
I
But
hope so. Yes.
I hope so. But there's a need still that the people who are closest to the coalface, the ones who are able to apply this to actual business problems, can
Yeah.
go and look and see how do we apply this to business problems? Like how do we change the system that we're
Yeah.
looking at? That how do we rethink the way that we do things by applying this new technology into that system? And that's most of the use cases I've seen out there have been here's the system as we've always done it today with all of the horrible aspects of like how slow everything's done, and we're just going to smear a layer of AI over the top of it, and
Yeah.
nothing really gets any better. You just find
Well,
where the constraint is.
I kind of blame the Pareto principle here, right? Whenever we're making some sort of change to an organization, process improvement, whatever it might be, we tend to focus, the 20% that has 80% of the value. The problem is that 20% that's left over is often the most difficult, the kind of, toughest conversations to have. One of the organizations that I'm working with right now has a tendency, which is of not moving people who are in the wrong place. So they get kind of the Peter principle, get promoted to a position. But once they're there, the organization doesn't have a great way of being able to tackle those tough conversations and say, this fits wrong. How can we rethink it? So we end up with a lot of individuals who are just in the wrong place. It's not that they're not, they and that whole organization kind of struggles a little bit with that, because that being in the right place has a tough conversation that needs to be had. And they're often the things that we hold back from doing. So now when AI comes along and accelerates or catalyzes those changes, it tends to kind of bring up these tough areas where we've been avoiding having a decent conversation about it and making the difficult decisions.
Yeah, it amplifies the weak spots in the
Yeah.
system. It'll make those very obvious very quickly. And
Yeah.
then it's a case of, well, you're going to have the conversation about this. And
Yeah.
most organizations will just walk away.
Yeah, well, that's been their history, right? They've
Yes.
avoided them so far, so that one becomes much more difficult to deal with. And I think that when there's when the changes, for example, a new way of working, we've been involved in Agile and DevOps for many years, and that's part of what we're talking about. But the pace of those changes is pedestrian; it's human pace of change, which means we can take months and it's going to impact next year's performance conversations, not this year's. So it's very easy to put off some of those tougher conversations. But nowadays, the changes are happening in days and weeks.
Yeah.
Just the pace of what's there. Now, definitely there's governance and there's all of the infrastructure about how to get those commercialized and into production, those changes. But there's also those tough conversations that have to be had along the way, which don't have a mechanism to move at that pace either.
Yeah, we still have to move at a human pace for the human parts of the system.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And
it's
these are often human parts, right? They're the
yeah,
conversations about how do we manage and lead, how do we make tough decisions in uncertainty without just rolling the dice and hoping.
the warm-blooded, non-deterministic nodes of the system. So with that in mind, how would you sum this up for our listeners?
So one of the things, and I don't know if we've really formally defined it, is this sort of the organizational immune system, and recognizing that just like our own immune system, that immune system is there for a purpose, and it's a positive thing, not a negative thing.
Yes.
We're often banging into it with a view that it's a negative thing, but we have to recognize that actually it's there for a reason. It serves a purpose. We don't want to get rid of it. We want to understand it and work with it and make some very kind of carefully thought through changes to it, so that the immune response isn't attacking the bits that we're trying to move and change, and for good reasons bring in these new beneficial changes. So that would be the first thing.
It makes me think of value stream mapping in terms of as a way of making that system visible so that you can identify where those changes should be. And especially, one of the things I've had to tell you, well, we don't have any value streams. I go, well, you do. You just don't know what they look like. And
and they're intertwined, and they're not really like, it's like a ball of wool that you've got to unpack somehow.
Yes, and work out what are those different threads, and work out where are all those dependencies and all that mess that's causing this to slow down, and work out where there's conflict and what needs to be addressed. So, I mean, that's the kind of exercise which can be incredibly valuable. It's not the only way of doing it. There are others, but it's a good way of looking at, like, what are the parts of my system I need to look at.
I couldn't agree more. That whole idea of just being able to put some terminology together, some agreed what the steps are, whatever it might be that come in, just allows us to understand things a lot better. And I think another piece that comes into it, really building on that value stream mapping, is recognizing behaviors which are needing to be modified or changed. So in many cases, for example, we don't want people experimenting too much when they're doing certain things. We want them to be somewhat repeatable within, depends what exactly it is, but we want that sort of not too much variation in many cases. So we put a lot of structure in place to limit variation. And what we'll often see now is where the push towards more innovation, more change, you actually want to turn those immune responses that limit innovation and limit variation. We want to tune those down so that we can get something back up that we've been actively muting.
Well, the interesting part there is if you're looking for consistency in the system which you've been aiming for, and you've just armed everybody in your organization with something that's incredibly variable. That's purely variable, in fact.
Yes, and of course that is generating an immune response and behaviors that people are unclear about, and people sort of pausing and not knowing exactly what the next steps look like.
Yeah, because it isn't as simple as like pull up your ChatGPT prompt and type something into it. There's a lot more to it in terms of thinking about how do these systems need to interact to actually create value within the organization.
And where are the opportunities that emerge as a result of that? And I think there is some great, I'm finding it interesting. There's one or two really interesting stories around organizations. And I think it's IKEA is one of them. The customer service department of IKEA brought in AI to automate the majority of customer service inquiries, something like 47% reduction in those customer service inquiries coming in. But what they found was that the additional inquiries were all to do with interior design, very much human-centered discussions. And so they retrained the customer service agents to be much more focused on interior design and being able to answer those tougher questions. Rumor has it, at least what I remember, about $1 billion on the bottom line as a result of those changes. That's that interesting mix of how do we remove the standardized piece and then leverage or bring in some variability that actually has value for the organization.
Exactly. I think we managed more than 3 this time. So
yeah, there's quite a few there that we tacked in, but there were some interesting stories there too.
Yeah. Well, with that, I think we should wrap up for this week. And thank you to all our listeners as always. And don't forget to hit subscribe and tell all your friends about us. And you can reach out to us at feedback@definitelymaybeagile.com. Okay, till next time.
Peter, again, thanks again.
You've been listening to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where your hosts, Peter Madison and David Sharrock, focus on the art and science of digital, agile, and DevOps at scale.